Hey there, everybody. Sorry that I kind of sound pretty bad. I am a little under the weather right now, but I wanted to put out a quick video educating people about a common misconception with understanding the position that schizophrenia holds within the discourse of anti-oedipus capitalism and schizophrenia. So, why schizoanalysis directly involves schizophrenic people. Part 1. The misconception. Understanding the problem. In Introduction to Schizoanalysis in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari, therefore called DG from this point on, explain the difference between clinical schizophrenia and the schizo process. This is to both acknowledge the powerful process of schizoanalysis as demonstrated by schizophrenia, as well as to acknowledge that it is a terrible predicament and not really desirable in of itself. Understanding the problem continued. DG go to great lengths to explain two things. One, that the schizophrenic reveals a special process that is happening everywhere, all the time, so it's happening not just in the schizophrenic, but it's also happening in the analyst, in the institution, and also that the clinical schizophrenic suffers not as a result of schizophrenization itself, but rather as a result of how the schizophrenic condition can form one of three endpoints as a result of this condition, right? So it can either end in neurosis, right? So basically the schizo is essentially recaptured into the apparatuses of capital, catatonia, or uncontrolled deterritorialization, which is just like there's no like sense of being or self anymore. You're just kind of like everywhere, right? So we have this like problem where people might like read Deleuze and Guattari like really quickly or something, and they might have this poor interpretation. Becoming schizophrenic, pretending to be schizophrenic has always been a serious problem for interpreting DG for over 50 years now. Yeah, it's been a problem that long, basically, like pretty much ever since it's come out. It's pretty well known that like you'll read these interviews that they have like right after they released Anti-Oedipus, and they're just like correcting themselves constantly. It's kind of ridiculous. So, for example, many accelerationists believed in 2020 that uncontrolled deterritorialization towards schizophrenia would free them in one way or another from Oedipus. That's actually a big reason why I pushed a movement on Twitter back then to really separate those two and to really emphasize the difference between, the difference between schizophrenia and schizophrenization, and why they were kind of different. And, you know, regrettably, I feel like part of that influence was, you know, and not saying like I'm the only person who was doing it, but like, you know, I feel that part of my influence through that direction is just, you know, encouraging an interpretation that kind of like cuts out the schizophrenic by saying, oh, they're injured, they're harmed, and that's not really what is intended, right? So what is the misconception? As a result, many people seem to misinterpret this part of Anti-Oedipus as suggesting that DG never thought that schizophrenics should actually be part of a revolutionary process. However, this is not what they were trying to imply with the statement, and it's also not true. Part 2. Very basic introduction to clinical schizophrenia. This is not a replacement for any sort of medical like education or anything. It's literally just an introduction. What is clinical schizophrenia like? First phase. This is like, I think it's called the prodromal phase. I can't remember on the top of my head, but it's when you're like developing the symptoms slowly over time. People might have strange beliefs or experiences, and it often takes years to develop into active psychotic episodes. Active psychosis. This is what people usually think of when they hear schizophrenia. This is when you're hallucinating and having delusions and, you know, thinking everything's coming at you all at once, or you know, thinking that you like found out the secret to the universe or whatever. And negative symptoms. This is most of what you experience after you recover from, you know, active psychosis. This is like the what you might call like the flat affect. There's kind of like a difficulty with connecting with other people. It's kind of like it's just kind of like, I think the best way to describe negative schizophrenic symptoms is it's kind of like, it's like there's a chunk missing that makes it really hard for a person who's had, that level of psychosis actually like recover from it fully, right? Which makes it was a big part of what makes it a chronic condition as opposed to like just a random psychotic episode, right? Like, again, to be clear, I'm not like formally I'm not formally diagnosed with schizophrenia. My diagnosis is technically bipolar 1 disorder with manic psychosis, but I believe that this diagnosis is not fully correct. I don't know what exactly it would be. Probably schizoaffective, if I was gonna be honest, but I'm not gonna I'm not a doctor, so I can't say that for myself. But in my personal experience, the negative symptoms are actually really challenging to deal with. It's easy to like kind of write them off when you're reading like a Wikipedia article or something, but that's kind of like dissociation, confusion, and kind of like just not fully being there basically, but not like having like a bunch of psychosis and shit. It's just kind of like, you know what I mean? Memory issues, that's another thing, right? So, as a result, psychotic disorders are difficult to live with, but that doesn't mean that people with them can never, ever function, right? And it was important for DG to acknowledge the real struggle of people suffering through schizophrenia, both to understand its relationship to schizophrenization, as well as to discourage the idea that we should try to become schizophrenic, right? Because it's like we don't want to, like, rip off your arm to cause a revolution, but it's not necessarily wrong to have an arm missing, I guess is another way to look at it. In other words, DG were actually saying that schizophrenia reveals something about the world that everyone has access to, not just schizophrenics. Clinical schizophrenia is specifically when the schizophrenic process is recaptured into medical treatment. In most cases, it is not appropriate for a schizophrenic to be on the front lines, and they recognize this, but they still wanted their audience to recognize the power of schizophrenia. DG correct this in interviews. Felix Guattari: we never talked of an identification of the analyst and the schizophrenic. We said that the analyst, like the militant, like the writer, like anyone else in fact, is more or less caught up in a schizo procedure. And we always made a distinction between the schizo procedure and the schizophrenic, in the bin whose schizo procedure is either brought to a stop or left spinning in a vacuum. We did not say that revolutionaries should identify with mad people spinning around aimlessly, but that they should carry out their undertakings along the line of the schizo process. Part 3. Why No Schizos Allowed doesn't work with Guattari. A few notes about this section. This section specifically focuses primarily on Guattari because I specialize in his work, but also because he is the source of most of DG's output on psychoanalysis, which is relevant to this problem. Guattari and Laborde were essential in formulating Deleuze's conception of the schizophrenic, and Deleuze was kind of afraid of schizophrenics and distanced himself and his work from it later, unlike Guattari. According to Intersecting Lives, there was this quote that says, "Jill said to me, 'How can you stand those schizos? He couldn't bear the sight of crazy people.'" So yeah, I'd rather have the opinion of the side of the duo that, actually, was interested in schizophrenics and worked with them, as opposed to just using them as an example for their own work. So, and not to diss on Deleuze, but just kind of making that clear. So first, Guattari advocates for taking schizophrenic work seriously. Check out this text from Reflections on Institutional Psychotherapy for Philosophers. Will the day ever come when President Schreber's and Ottrod's definitions of God are studied with the same attention and same rigor as though of Descartes or Malebranche? How long will we maintain the separation between theoretical critique and the concrete analytical activity of the human sciences? Can the damages caused by this divide at the heart of anthropology be equated to the circumstances that split the world with an iron curtain? And isn't it being split again in many other regions according to the nature of the development of the state? Guattari tries to encourage patients to participate in 1968 protests. This is in Intersecting Lives again. It says, he, Guattari, started visiting Nanterre University in April 1968 to see for himself the movement led by charismatic Daniel Cohn-Bendit, a talented, or I know his name is Daniel the Red, I just don't know his full name. A talented orator with a devastating sense of humor and an innate sense of timing. Guattari returned to Laborde but called out the troops. Doctors, monitors, interns, and patients were invited to join the ranks of the revolution in Paris. Jean Houry, the clinic director, was sympathetic to the movement but found Guattari irresponsible in encouraging patients to join the demonstrations. Like, he's literally bringing patients to 1967 protests, or 1968's protests. This is before May 1968, but, like, he's still bringing people to the protests. That's fucking crazy. Okay? So, yeah, he definitely doesn't agree there. Early versions of Guattari's screenplay include schizos involved in political activity. Project for a Film on Free Radio is a script about a woman and her schizophrenic friend helping free radio stations broadcast important news during a fascist uprising in Turin, Italy. This character would later become Eric in Unamur Die Week, and he's kind of less political in that plot, but that plot is also really weird and strange. Just read the screenplay. Just read it already. Molecular Revolution. Molecular Revolution was an essay collection published in English in 1984 as an anti-psychiatry political text. Like his friends David Cooper and R.D. Laing, Guattari was interested in experimenting with revolutionary psychiatry which actively involved schizophrenics. So here are some quotes from Molecular Revolution. What I am now proposing is not only a temporary measure. There are different measures of formulations that I have found useful to mark different stages in an institutional experiment. I think it is sensible to set out different kinds of ideas. I think it's sensible to set out a kind of ideas of grid of correspondences between the meandering of meanings and ideas among psychotics, especially schizophrenics, and the mechanisms of growing discordance being set up at all levels of industrial society in the neo-capitalist and bureaucratic socialist phase, whereby the individual tends to have to identify with an ideal of consuming machines, producing machines. The silence of the catatonic is perhaps the pioneering interpretation of that ideal. If the group is going to structure itself in terms of the rejection of the spoken word, what response is there apart from silence? How can an area of that society be altered so that to make even a small dent in the process of reducing the spoken word to a written system? In my view, then, there are two possible politics in relation to signification. Either one accepts its de jure as an inevitable effect, and expects, therefore, to find it at every semiotic level, or one accepts it de facto in the context of a particular political system, and one proposes to counter it with a generalized micropolitical struggle that it can undermine it from within, in such a way that it is to enable all the intensive multiplicities to escape from the tyranny of the signifying over-encoding. What this means is unleashing a whole host of expressions and experimentations, those of children, of schizophrenics, of homosexuals, of prisoners, of misfits of every kind, that all work to penetrate and eat into the semiology of the dominant order, to feel out new escape routes and produce new and unheard of constellations of signifying particle signs. And here's the last quote. In our societies, people must not gesticulate overmuch. We must stay in our proper place, sign on the dotted line, recognize the signals that we are given, and any failure may land us in prison or hospital. Rather than looking upon the schizophrenic as someone who's paralyzed inside their own body and needs to be looked after, it might be better to try to see, rather than interpret, how he functions in the social situation he has to contend with, and what are the transversal diagrammic problems he is facing us with. It is not a matter of aping schizophrenics, playing at catatonics, but to discovering how a mad person, a child, a homosexual, a prostitute, etc., shifts the components of desire about in a social arena, while we, the normal, take care to let well alone. What does it matter to us whether dramas of a symbolic, pre-significant order or a post-significant order are being acted out in the body of a lunatic, a child, or anyone else? Is it our job to adjust such people so that they fit into the world, to treat deviants? What do we mean when we talk of treating a schizophrenic? One wonders whether it is more a matter of his being there to challenge us rather than of our being there to look after him. Part 4. Conclusion. Why is it wrong to deny the schizo their position in DG's discourse? DG made a clarification to explain the difference between clinical schizophrenia and schizophrenization as a process. They wanted to refute claims that they wanted to just send vulnerable schizos to the front lines irresponsibly, not that schizophrenics can't participate. DG valued the disruptive capabilities that the schizophrenic has, but they are not unique to a schizophrenic, but they're actually happening everywhere.